Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Enrico Fardella. I'm a professor at the University of Naples L'Orientale. We are here today for the second appointment of a laboratory that we organized at the University of Naples Orientale on China and the Middle East from the Cold War to the present. This is a laboratory which is specifically dedicated to the master course on relations and institutions of Asia and Africa. And we began last week with my colleague from Fudan, who is attending today, and my partner in crime in the ChinaMed Project, Professor Andrea Ghiselli, who is here with us, and who will help me with his expertise also to stimulate the conversation and act as a sort of discussant to the renowned scholar, Professor Niu Xinchun. We all welcome him with a digital applause. Professor Niu Xinchun is first of all is a renowned scholar and is the director of the Middle East Research Institute of China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, which is one of the most prominent research center in China, founded in 1965, if I'm not wrong, and that he's overseen by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Professor Niu Xinchun he graduated with a master's degree from the History Department of Jilin University and got his PhD from CICIR itself. And he has been working as director of the Middle East Institute since 2011. Actually, it's a very important year for two reasons, because, as we know, it's the year of the Libyan crisis. Here in connected, we also have Professor Tang Tianbo, who is an expert on this issue, and is also a colleague of Professor Niu Xinchun in the same department. And it's a very important year because, as we said in our first appointment, thanks to the support and expertise of Andrea Ghiselli, it was a moment of revision of China's foreign policy. It was like a moment when China started shifting and becoming moving towards a more proactive diplomacy, and in some cases, people may say that also more assertive. And the Middle East has been considered by several observers as a sort of laboratory in this respect, and of course, Professor Niu Xinchun is the most ideal person to explain us how this approach has unfolded and whether it's changed and how it's changed over the time. That's why I asked him, and I'm very pleased to have him with us today, to talk about the evolution of Chinese foreign policy towards this very important region, not just for China, of course, but also for us Europeans, but also for the US, for Russia these days, that has been more and more active in the last few years. And so we will basically divide this our appointment today with 45 minutes, something like that, presentation by Professor Niu Xinchun, and then we will try to keep a good 45 minutes Q&A, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of interesting curiosities and questions from myself and the other participants. I just would like to say that, and then I will leave the floor to Professor Niu, that all along these years that I spent in China and reading and learning from Chinese scholars, I must say, and this is something that I truly believe in, that Professor Niu Xinchun writing are, to me, at least the most instructive on this issue, and one of the most stimulating readings I've ever had in my life. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, besides listening at Professor Niu Xinchun lecture today, you really want to read Professor Niu's articles, and especially recently he published and actually shared with us and for the students of my laboratory two interesting recent contributions, one in Chinese that I didn't share with them because not all of them speak Chinese, and one in English that is actually I think is going to be basically the main content of Professor Niu today. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Niu Xinchun, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico, for your invitation, and thank you for your generous introduction, to some extent flattering introduction. And I was asked to talk about the evolution of China's Middle East policy since 1949. That is a long period, so a lot of content to touch on. So firstly, I would say in recent year, as you mentioned, that with China's activities increasing in the Middle East, the China Middle policy was be paid attention by a lot of international scholars. But I would say there are a lot of misunderstanding about China's Middle East policy. I think there are three popular narratives about the current China Middle East policy. Every narrative has its privilege and weakness. The first narrative is that China's Middle East policy is that China is a free rider. So these analysts think China's activity in the Middle East is passive, not proactive. They think China benefit from its economic relationship with the Middle East, but China did not contribute to the Middle East in terms of international common goods or regional common goods. So China is a free rider. The second narrative is that China's policy is an economic-centered policy. So these analysts think China's main activity, China's main goal in the Middle East is economic benefit. So China's strategic activity, political activity, and military activity all contributing or help to China's economic interest. The third narrative is that China's Middle East policy is a grand strategy. China's final goal is to replace the United States. China become the only dominating country in the Middle East. So they think the current way China deal with the Middle East, like China's economic activity or economic goal, is just a springboard. And through economic activity, China take economic involvement as an instrument to achieve its long-term strategic goals. So all the three narratives have some good explanation to China's policy, but I think that is partial, not complete. Some narrative misleading. So I will divide the China's middle policy since 1949 into three periods, three stages. And the every stage or every period has its own characteristics. Every period have a different focus. So The first stage or first period is from 1949 to 1991. So that is a Cold War period. And during that period, China's first priority in the Middle East is great power competition. So during the 1950s, the whole world is divided into two blocks. One block is socialist bloc or Eastern bloc. The other bloc is Western bloc or capitalist bloc. During that time, China has allied with the Soviet Union against the United States and Europe. So at that time, China took Middle East as part of the encirclement of United States against the socialist bloc. So during that time, China has supported the Middle East countries' national independence movement, like China supported Egypt, Syria, and Iraq's national independence movement against Western countries' imperialism. Also, during that time, since the Western country diplomatically blockaded China, most Western countries recognized Taiwan as a sovereignty, refused to recognize mainland China. So at that time, Middle East is a very important diplomatic battlefield. By 1959, in the whole world, there were 31 countries recognized mainland China. Among the 31 countries, there are 12 countries socialist countries. So 18 countries are non-socialist countries. So among the 18 countries and 18 non-socialist countries, there are 12 Middle East countries. So that means in the diplomatic battlefield, Middle East played a very important role for the diplomatic recognition for China. So after that, the Chinese diplomat called Middle East as the big bloc of Arab country. That means the big bloc of Arab country played a very important role in the diplomatic area. So that is the situation in 1950s. In 1970s, since China split with the socialist China breaking away from the socialist bloc, and during that time, since the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan, and China think the Soviet Union want to encircle China from the north, from the east. So at that time, Middle East actually became the front line between the China and the Soviet competition. So at that time, actually, China has coordinated with the United States to contain Soviet Union's expansion. So this period has persisted to the end of Cold War. After the 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the competition between the two blocs has disappeared from the international politics. The first period has ended and the second period has begun. So the second period, during the second period, the great power competition has disappeared, but China still concerned the United States' influence and expansion in the Middle East. But China did not take United States factor as the first priority. Although we are concerned the United States activity influence in the Middle East, but we do not take that as the first priority. Our first priority is economic interest during that time. Actually, started from the 1980s, Middle East's economic importance has become very prominent. So during the whole 1980s, the China's arms sale to the Middle East has accounted for more than 80%, 80% of China's all over arms sales to the whole world. And during that time, China's construction contract in the Middle East has accounted more than 60% of China's all overseas contract, construction contract. So that is a very big part. And also during that time, China's bilateral trade with the Middle East is very important. Middle East actually is China's fourth biggest trade partners. So in the 1980s, Middle East already played a very important economic role for China. And since 1993, China became an oil importer. So after that, energy, oil has become the most important factors in China's Middle East policy. So from 1993 to today, the Middle East is always accounting about half of China's oil imports. So now China is the biggest oil importer in the world. Every day, China imports about 10 million barrels per day oil, and the Middle East account about half. So from the energy perspective, Middle East is very important. And in the trade area, the Middle East account about 6% of China's global trade. And so from the perspective of bilateral trade, Middle East is something, but is not so important. And in terms of foreign direct investment, FDI, Middle East account about 3% or 5% of China's all FDI, overseas outflow FDI. The number is very small. So in the economic area, it is very clear. Energy is very important. Trade is something, and mutual FDI is very low, at a very low level. So for the bilateral economic relationship, I think China's importance to the Middle East is more than Middle East's importance to China. Of course, as I mentioned, energy is an exception. So in terms of bilateral trade, as I mentioned, the Middle East account 6% of China's global trade, but China account 13% of Middle East global trade. And in the FDI area, China account about 10% of Middle East FDA flow, and the Middle East account just 3 or 4% of China's FDA. So that means I think in the future, China is more and more important to the Middle East economy. For example, in the energy oil area, as I mentioned, in 1993, China account for 3% of Middle East oil export. But today, China account more than 30% of Middle East oil export. So I think in the future, this trend will continue. China will become more and more important to the Middle East. So this is the second period. So during the second period, economic interest become the top first factors, but still the great power competition and the big bloc of Arab countries' importance is still there, but not as important as before. For example, in the international diplomatic struggle between China and Western countries, the big bloc of Arab country is still important. But today, China has established a diplomatic relationship with more than 180 countries. So 22 countries is still a big bloc, but compared to 1959, during that time, China had diplomatic partnership only have 31. So compared with that time, the big bloc of Arab countries' importance actually is declining. So this is the second period. The third period is actually, I think, began from 2012 or just started from the last 10 years. So during the new period, the biggest change is that the China-United States relationship has greatly changed. As everyone knows that now, if we don't think China-United States has already went into the Cold War area, but at least we think now China and the United States has already pursued the global great power competition. So Middle East, China's Middle East policy will be affected by China-United States relationship. Actually, United States' Middle East policy already be influenced by the China-US relationship. Last July, before President Biden visited Saudi Arabia, he said why he wanted to go to Middle East, because he wanted to show that the United States do not leave Middle East. United States do not leave void space to be filled by China, Russia, and Iran. Especially last year, later December, United States has published its national security strategy. So it declared what? It proclaimed that the post-Cold War era is definitely over, and the competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. So that means for United States, its global strategy has come into a new era. The new era is one of competition between China and the United States. So as the national strategy report said, the competition between China and the United States is global, but different region of the global is affected by the strategy differently. For Middle East, I think Middle East is the least one affected by the United States new national strategy. The reason is that the competition between China and the United States mainly happened in Asia Pacific and Europe, because the United States mainly focus on high technology containment against China. So in terms of high technology competition, United States and Europe and Japan, South Korea, and this kind of country played an important role. Middle East, except Israel, has no role to play. So geographically, I think the competition between China and the United States mainly limited to Asia Pacific and Europe and North America. So Middle East in the position of periphery. So this is the international level. So at this level, Middle East is affected. China's Middle East policy affected by the competition of great power, but not so much, a little bit. And at the regional level, at the Middle East regional level, I think at this level, actually, China and the United States has a lot of common interest. The relationship between China and the United States at the regional level actually relaxed, not so tense. The reason is that in terms of most of international Middle East issues, China and the United States have a common goal and a common interest, like energy security, anti-terrorism, like the stability and the peace of Middle East, like the peace between Israel and Palestinian. Both China and the United States want to achieve this kind of goal. Actually, our interest is almost completely overlapped. The difference is that we have a different approach to pursue the common goals. So, for example, in the Syria issue, in Iran issue, and in Iraq issue, both China and the United States want to achieve peace and stability, but we have a different opinion and a different approach to pursue peace and stability. So at the regional level, I think the bilateral relation between United States and China is mostly compatible. And at the last level is the bilateral level between China and the United States. So at this level, actually, we have a conflicting interest between China and the United States. The reason is that in the past, in the history, China's economic involvement and the economic activity in the Middle East mainly at the low end of production value chain. And China, and on the other side, the United States has dominated or controlled the high-end of production value chain. So during that time, China's interest and the United States' interest are actually compatible. We do not compete with each other. But in the past 10 years, China has gradually climbed from the low end of production value chain to the high end of production value chain. So China now begin to take activity in the area of like 5G, like space technology, like healthcare technology, and green energy. So on the one hand, in this area, China will compete with the United States' domination. So I think this is a zero-sum game. On the other hand, that is more important, is that United States do not only look at China's economic activity from the economic perspective. Actually, United States has increasingly looked at China's economic activity from the security and political perspective. So from the perspective of the United States, they think China's economic activity in the Middle East actually pose or will pose political and security challenge for United States. Because in the past decades, United States has actually established an ecosystem in the Middle East composed of basic infrastructure, ports, weapons, and military base, and technology infrastructure. So now they think China wants to get into this ecosystem controlled by United States and its local partners. So they are very concerned that China's economic activity, but mainly I think from the political and security perspective. So this, I think, from the international level and regional level and bilateral level, I think the bilateral level is a main conflicting point between China and the United States in the foreseeable future. But at the present time, I don't think China will change its Middle East policy. I don't think China will return to the Cold War period. As I mentioned that during that period, great power competition is the first priority for China's Middle East policy. So now both China and the United States begin to pay more attention to great power competition. But I don't think neither has already decided to take great power competition as the first priority, especially for China. Firstly, China do not want to compete with United States globally, because that is not in China's interest. Especially in Middle East, China do not want to compete with United States. If one day we have to choose to compete with United States, I think definitely we will choose Asia Pacific, especially East Asia, because in that area we have, to some extent, we have some advantage. But in Middle East, until now, United States has a very prominent advantage. So we will not take our weakness to compete with United States' strength. But the problem is that at the present time, in United States, more and more people and more analysts take China as a global competitors. And more and more people think United States should compete with China in Middle East. At the same time, in China, more and more people begin to think about the great power competition with the United States in the Middle East. So this is the reason I think in the next few days, not a few days, next few years, China's Middle East policy is actually at the crossroad. Whether we will return to the great power competition or we continue to take economic interest as the first priority, or we will combine different factors like great power competition and economic interest and diplomatic competition mixed together. It depends both sides assessment. So I think I stopped here.
Thank you very much, Professor Niu. As always, very enlightening. I will take advantage of my role and start like monopolizing the beginning of the debate. Let's start from the wording that you just used to describe US-China competition in the region. There are several aspects that can be touched. We try to organize them. But we can begin with the major power competition in the region. So U.S. and China. You say that U.S. and China, they have actually some compatible interest in the region, but and China is not interested in competing with any other states in the region. The U.S. is certainly competing with China globally because is clearly identifying China as a challenger. Adversarial challenger of US-led global order, governance, and therefore implicitly US lifestyle. So we are certainly in a Cold War climate, as you correctly suggested. Now, my first question is going back to the notion of compatibility. So at a potential level, you think that US and China interests in the region, they have a certain degree of compatibility. That means that China interests in the region are therefore not compatible with Russian interest?
Firstly, I don't think Russia is in the Middle East, in some area like in Syria. Russia played a very important role, especially in terms of military. But in the whole Middle East's economic, political, and security area, I don't think Russia is bigger players. So I think generally speaking, we have a common interest with both United States and Russia, because for United States, as I mentioned, that both China and the United States want the energy security and stability and peace and anti-terrorism. For Russia, I think Russia have almost the same goals with China and the United States in terms of stability, peace, in terms of Iranian nuclear issues. But the problem is that I mentioned that we always have a different stand, have a different opinion, have a different approach to achieve this common interest and common goals.
I see. Well, to a certain extent, like I think it's evident that there is actually probably, as you suggest, more compatibility to a certain level between, in some aspect of US-China vision of stability for the region vis-a-vis the Russian one. But let's talk about then. You just mentioned Iran. The world is actually has to deal with the real possibility for Iran to reach the point of no return in its nuclear development, and we may foresee, we hope we're not, but a scenario where a U.S.-Israeli Gulf coalition will take some action, to deal with this scenario. What China is going to do in this situation? Is China going to take side, or is China? Is there any talking about compatibility? Is there any space for compatible cooperation between China and the U.S. in dealing with such a escalation?
I think in terms of Iranian nuclear issue, actually in the past 20 years, China, at most of time, China has cooperated or at least co-dominate with the United States. As last year, when the United States State Department's Assistant Secretary for Near East, Assistant Secretary Leaf said, when somebody asked her that whether China is helpful in the Iranian nuclear issues, she said most of the time China has cooperated with the United States. So that includes in the 2015 nuclear deal. So before the deal agreed, China played a very positive role to reach that deal. And in the recent 2 years, actually, I think most of the time China cooperated with the United States and Russia and European countries. So because we, again, we have a common goals. All countries do not agree Iran to reach the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, but in case of a military escalation, you think that you will China? Okay, we have an experience of Ukraine, for example, right? I mean, in the case of Ukraine, China is taking a sort of pro-Russian neutrality, we can call it. You foresee a sort of like pro-Iranian neutrality also in a situation of an escalation in the region?
Actually, I think today, from the perspective of Western countries, China is already in the position of you call the pro-Iran neutrality, because at the present time, almost all the Western companies has already cut off its relation with Iran, and but China has continued to insist its normal economic trade and investment relationship with Iran. So from a perspective of Western countries, China continue to import Iranian oil. China continue trade with Iran. Last year, China's bilateral trade with Iran has reached more than 1.5 million, 15 billion US dollars. So from maybe from your perspective, we're already pro-Iranian neutrality. But But of course, we don't think that so. We don't think that is true. We think the Western country has taken the violent place, not China.
Yeah. In the one of the my favorite Chinese scholar that I think we discussed about him in one of our meetings in the past is Professor Zhang Xiaodong. Professor Zhang Xiaodong, he published an article. I mean, he was one of the first say Chinese scholar to discuss about the beginning of a more proactive China policy in the region. And the reason he, in an article in 1999 that he published, Professor Zhang Xiaodong was a professor of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I'm just referring all this stuff. I know that you are much more aware than us of Professor Zhang Xiaodong's work, but of course, our audience here and the students, they may not be aware of it. So I give some context to what I'm about to say. Before jumping to the question. So Professor Zhang Xiaodong basically was trying to suggest a proactive China policy in the region in order to contain the possible spread of Islamic influence from the region into Chinese Western provinces and in particular to Xinjiang. And he was so suggesting to create a positive framework of economic and political cooperation with the Middle Eastern countries to deal with this reality. And he was looking at Iran and Iran geopolitical role as a central part of this kind of policy. Because Iran has this kind of dual role as a oil hub and security guarantor for the Persian Gulf, and at the same time for Central Asia, also seen in light of Shia influence in both areas. But something very interesting that I would like to discuss with you is Professor Zhang Xiaodong's connection between China's special relations with Iran and the Taiwan issue. So he was suggesting somehow to correlate China's upper hand in Iran as a bargaining chip for U.S. support of Taiwan independence. Consider that the article that Professor Zhang Xiaodong published in 1999 was published a few years later of the 1995-96 crisis in the Taiwan Strait. What do you think of Professor Zhang Xiaodong's view? Do you think that this is something that still somehow has preeminence or relevance for today's China's policy in the area?
As you mentioned, in the early 1990s, some Chinese scholars talked about, as you mentioned, that China used Iran against the Sunni Islamist movement, and China can use Iran as a bargaining chip in terms of Taiwan issue. But at the present time, in the recent years, maybe Professor Tang can say something about this issue. But I did not notice anyone talking about China use Iran to contain Islamist movement. China use Iran as a bargaining chip in Taiwan issue. The reason is that I think in terms of Islamist movement, actually in the past 10 years, the Islamist movement in the Middle East has changed a lot. I think dramatically has changed. So in the late of 1990s and early 2000 years, the Islamist movement is rising. And in 2011, the political Islamist movement is also surging. But in the past 10 years, in the whole Middle East, actually the Islamist movement, especially political Islamist movement, is actually declining. And the fact is that most of Sunni Islamist country like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other Gulf countries actually take actions to moderate Islamist movement, to contain Islamist movement. So today, if we continue to talk about China use Iran to against the Islamist movement, that is useless, pointless. And in terms of Taiwan issue, the problem is that United States can use Taiwan as a bargaining chip against China. The basic reason is that United States have the capacity to control Taiwan. So if you want to use somebody as an instrument and bargaining chip, you have to have the power or capacity to control this instrument. But for China and Iran relationship, I don't think China has the capacity to control Iran. So that is the reason we don't have the capacity to use Iran as a bargaining chip against the United States.
Well, yeah, but first of all, I don't necessarily agree with Professor Zhang Xiaodong analysis, but I just want to know whether it had some relevance, for you in today's China policy. He didn't. Maybe I didn't make myself clear. I didn't say that China's relationship with Iran are meant to be used as a containment of the radicalization of Islam, of the Sunni Islam. No. It was like the original intention of Zhang Xiaodong, thought of relaunching a more proactive Middle East policy that was meant to contain that phenomenon back then in the 1990s. But then within this configuration, Iran had a very important geopolitical role, as much as it does have Iran today. I remember you in 2014, we worked together for an article that was one of the things that you wrote is an article in Chinese that you wrote that was very inspiring to me. And in this article, you mention something. You say that there are three primary disagreements between China and America on the Middle Eastern policy. Of course, we are talking about 10 years ago. But there is an interesting passage here that actually attracted my attention. You say, I quote, the first disagreement regards China's support for Arab countries in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. The second is China's support for Iran. And the third one is China's opposition towards Western intervention in the region, domestic affairs. These three situations involve China's core values and domestic affairs. And so that's why you say compromising on these three aspects would result in damage to China's Middle Eastern interest and will not help to improve US-China relations. So my question is, in which way the China support for Iran concern China's core values and domestic affairs?
China domestic affairs, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because you say that the disagreement between China and the US has three different levels. One of these points is China's support for Iran. And then you say these three situations involve China's core values and domestic affairs. And so China cannot compromise on these three aspects because they would damage China's Middle Eastern interest. So I'm trying to understand how China's support for Iran can be interpreted through the prism of China's core values and domestic affairs.
I think you mentioned that what I want to say is between China and the United States, one basic fundamental disagreement is that United States take intervention activities in the Middle East. The United States intervene the Middle East countries' domestic issues, like during the Arab Spring, and the United States involved Iranians' domestic politics, like recently United States imposed sanctions on Iran because of Iranian massive demonstration issues. So from this perspective, actually insist to protect the sovereignty is the basic China's interest, is the core interest of China. So I think from this perspective, China against the United States intervention in Arab Spring issue, intervention on Iranian domestic issue, and that's in China's interest.
Wonderful. Okay, so maybe Andrea, you want to say something on Iran? Or you want to ask a question to?
Yes. Sorry, I was unmuting myself. It's about Iran and it's about sovereignty, but not China's sovereignty. I was curious about your understanding of China's position on the island disputes between the United Arab Emirates and Iran, since the joint statement made by China and the GCC countries in December, which caused quite a lot of concerns in Iran. So what do you think happened? What's your understanding of
Andrea, sorry, can you do you mind, because our audience is not necessarily aware of what you're talking about. So if you can provide some context, it would be great.
Yes, sorry. So in December, of course, there was a very important visit made by the Chinese President Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia with a series of important summits, both bilateral and multilateral. At the end of one of these summits, there was a joint statement in which the disputed islands between the United Arab Emirates and Iran were mentioned as well. And this joint statement was unusually, you would say, in favor of the UAE. Somehow indicating that there is a dispute and that and so by indicating the dispute of this, by indicating the existence of this dispute, there was also then it implied that also Iran not necessarily had sovereignty over those islands, which again is a very unusual statement. And indeed, the Iranian authorities and media and commentators finally expressed this concern. And this is why also we see probably the visit of Raisi very recently in Beijing, and Hu Chunhua visited Iran as well earlier this year. So my question is, what do you think? What's your understanding of this unusual statement, the unusual reference to the disputed islands?
Okay, very good questions. I think firstly, I don't know the backdoor decision making on these issues. What is China's domestic internal intention? I don't know. But what I can say is that I think in the past decades, China has kept a balanced relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel. I don't think China, personally, I don't think China has wanted to change that position. I don't think the joint declaration between China and Arab country has the intention to change the balanced position. So, but as you mentioned, the declaration between China and the Arab country has made Iranian unhappy. And last month, the declaration between China and Iran has made the Israelis unhappy. So my personal observation and explanation is that the Middle East politics is very complicated. Once China has involved deeply in political area, it is very difficult to keep a balanced policy. So I think China is still on the learning curve. So we are still in the early stage to politically involved in the Middle East affairs. So I don't think that is a signal that China wants to change its current balanced policy.
I agree completely.
So we are waiting for some questions from the audience. We still have like quite a lot of time. So I continue to ask questions. You just mentioned briefly the role of Israel and the Israel disappointment with some China's action. Actually, on the bilateral relation between Israel and China, with the U.S. pressure notwithstanding, there has been like recently, at least in my opinion, a certain change in the way how they approach each other. In the past, China and Israel, they have somehow agreed to disagree on a series of political issues. So China was trying to separate this issue from economic connection and relations with Israel, and on the other side, Israel was somehow avoiding to emphasize, his frustration for certain China's action, especially vis-a-vis Iran. But in the last couple of years, something has changed. China has intensified even more recently the statements on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and Israel on his side start like before was ignoring actually some China's action, for example, in Xinjiang, especially in the UN contest. But Israel has actually recently joined international criticism towards China, and especially towards the treatment of Uyghur minority. Furthermore, we have seen that Israel is responding more actively, I would say, to the U.S. Is a request for further screening of Chinese economic activities in the country. So, what has happened, and how do you foresee this relationship to unfold in the next years?
Okay. I think for the China-Israel relationship, there are good news and bad news. So firstly, let me to say the good news. The good news is that in the past few years, the economic relationship between China and Israel has improved. Last year, the bilateral trade between China and Israel is beyond $20 billion, and China is the third biggest trade partner of Israel. And today, the Chinese company still want to go to Israel to buy technology, and the Israel companies still think China is a very big, attractive market. So the basic framework especially in the economic area, is still there. I think after the COVID-19 lockdown and China and Israel economic relationship will continue to be improved in the next few years, because we need Israel's innovation, and Israel need China's markets. That is mutual benefit. So this is good news. So bad news is that, as you mentioned, we used to agree the disagree. But now both China and Israel begin to speak out the disagree. As you mentioned, in the past 2 years, Israel has voted against China in UN Human Rights Commission. That had never happened before. And China actually take more proactive activities in the Palestinian issue. But in China side, I think why we take more active action in the Palestinian issue, the main reason is that in the past few years, the Israeli right-wing government has pursued a lot of provocative, assertive activities against its own Arab citizens and the West Bank citizens and the West Bank Arab peoples and Gaza Strip. So that is the reason we take more active activities. Our activity is a response to Israel's right-wing government's policy. So you mentioned that the United States is increasing pressure on Israel government. I think that is a very important factor. As I mentioned before, in the whole Middle East, this region is the one with least affected by great power competitions, but Israel is an exception. The reason is that Israel is a high-tech innovation countries. So United States want to block or cut off China and Israel innovation cooperations. So I think you are correct that Israel had increased its screen on China-Israel innovation cooperation. But until now, I still think Israel want to keep some balance between United States and China. I don't think Israel has already decided to completely side with the United States in economic area. So they want to take economic benefit from China. At the same time, they also want to take political and military benefit from the United States. As everyone knows that United States is the biggest political supporter in the international area with Israel. So United States is the most important ally for Israel, but still Israel want to take economic benefit from China. So they try very hard to keep this balanced relationship.
So you think that this evident shift in the bilateral relations is mostly derived mostly by China's response to the, more radicalization of Israeli domestic politics so as a sort of response to Israel domestic turn towards the right and their rising pressure towards the West Bank?
I think this is the result of comprehensive factors. United States pressure is one factor, and China-Iranian relationship is another factor. And the Israel's new government, right-wing government policy is another factors. So that is not one factor's result.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's like, especially in sight of this, the potential escalation over Iran and the nuclear issue. Certainly, I mean, Israel. I mean, this is what I learned and I heard from Israeli colleagues. The uncertainty about China position in this issue, of course, somehow vis-a-vis U.S. support of Israel, of course, it's like maybe a cause of, say, frustration, or actually is a cause of frustration. But there is, I think that I totally agree with you when you say that Israel has not decided yet and is somehow taking a sort of neutral, or is trying to not to take side in the contest of U.S.-China competition. Another scholar that I really I'm learning from, a Chinese scholar, is Professor Xin Hong from Renmin University. Professor Xin Hong, I mean, for us, he's also has a background of Cold War studies, and he recently emphasized in his article over and over the fact that the emerging polarization of world politics will bring back a very important notion that at least it's important to me, and that is not very much, I would say, studied in the West, not as much as it should, in my opinion. And I'm actually working and writing, as Andrea knows, an article about that, which is the resilient relevance of Mao Zedong intermediate zone theory. Which is something that Mao firstly introduced in 1946 during an interview with Henry Strong, and which is basically a sort of vision of global vision of power distribution in Mao's perspective. Very interesting indeed, and in my opinion, quite resilient, because of course, Mao's analysis is also at the core of the three-world theory presented in 1974 at the United Nations by Deng Xiaoping, and to a certain extent still has some resilience today in China's evident preference and political investment in the developing world, in the global south. Professor Xin Hong is creating this parallelism. Basically, is saying that the rise of this big power competition is bringing back the emphasis of the intermediate zone. So he says like that countries like Israel belong to this middle ground, this intermediate zone, together with other several actors, some major powers, whose individual weight is not as large as that one of China and the United States, but which are sufficiently powerful, independent, and strategic to force the US and China to make important concessions to them. So he thinks that this intermediate zone, this middle ground, we can call it in different way, will represent the main trend of world politics in the future rather than superpower competition. I think, I tend to agree. And what you mentioned about Israel, I think emphasized that the Middle East actually is taking this direction. What do you think?
Okay, firstly, you mentioned that the Israeli scholars said to you that they are frustrated about China's uncertainty.
No, they're not. They're not. I'm not quoting Israeli scholar. I'm just saying that there is uncertain. This uncertain, position of China in this in a context of escalation with Iran, of course, may create frustration. It's different.
Okay, so actually, they complain to us that to us, China's policy is always too concerted. The reason is that in the past almost 10 years, the Israeli side want to persuade China's position on the Palestinian-Israel issue and in the Iranian issue. They want China to at least abstain in the voting of United Nations Assembly and the United Nations Security Council in terms of Israel-Palestinian issue. But China's activity is always certain. Every time China has supported the Palestinian issue. And in terms of Iranian issue, China is always, in most of the time, stand with Iran. So they complain to us that China's policy is too certain, not uncertainty. So the Xinchun's opinion about the intermediary region. Actually, in the past year, China's scholar has beginning to pay more and more attention to the intermediate theory. So, because that is one of theory of Cold War great power competition. But personally, I disagree with that theory. The reason is that even if today China-United States relationship has some kind of Cold War characteristics, but there are fundamental differences between today's great power competition and the Cold War's great power competition. During the Cold War times, United States and the Soviet competed with each other complete globally. They compete with each other in every inch of land, in every region of the globe. And they compete with each other in every area, including covered military area, political area, ideology area, and every area. But today, China, I think the biggest difference between today's competition and the Cold War competition is that today China and the United States has a very close, deep relationship. Last year, the bilateral trade between China and the United States has reached 700 billion US dollar. So this is the biggest difference. During Cold War, the whole world divided into two blocks. The capitalist bloc has a very little economic relationship with the socialist bloc. But today, not only China and the United States have a very close relationship. Almost every country has got into the so-called global village. every country has depend on with other countries' relationship. So today's world did not divide it into two economic blocks. So this is the reason why there is no so-called intermediate area. Actually, every country, every area is an intermediate country. United States is China's biggest rivalry. China is United States' biggest competitor, but we have a very close relationships. So you can say United States is the intermediary area. So I personally disagree with that theory.
I tend to agree with you actually, in the sense that, you know, even in your article, you mentioned that one of the problem of China's Middle East policy is that somehow is stuck to this, prism that basically is a sort of is subordinate to China's relationship with the superpower, and in this case with the hegemonic power with the US. So somehow, China's policy in the Middle East could be, according to your writing, more efficient if we would somehow detach from, would be more independent from this competition or with the United States. So I tend to agree with you. You know, what you just mentioned, the fact that I can see this because I'm following the debate, and I'm writing on this. The reemergence of the intermediate zone somehow confirm this component. And Professor Itzhak Shikor, which is talking about Israel, Itzhak Shikor is like one of the oldest, one of the most renowned and expert on China's policy in the Middle East. He published a book I think in 1976, something like that. The first book and the most very popular in the West on China's policy in the Middle East. And he actually was specifically saying, repeating this point, saying that China's policy in the region is mostly a function of China's relationship with the superpower. So this kind of traditional prism seems continuing to prevail. And I tend to agree with you. The probably shifting perspective could be helpful in this regard in order to make China's approach to the region more, I would say, independent and maybe more efficient. What do you think?
I agree with you. Actually, that is one of my main point and opinion in the articles I sent to you. So I think China, in that article, I said China should try our best to avoid the great power competition. So the reason is that for China, the competition between China and the United States in the Middle East is not in China's interest, is not in United States' interest, especially not in Middle East countries' interest. So I think until now, China do not take any active activities against the United States' policy. So in that article, I think I wrote that actually for China and the United States, at the present time, China's position is that we fight our fight, you fight you fight. We do not intervene your activities. Please, you don't intervene our activities. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before, that in the past 10 years, because the global competition between China and the United States, because at the regional level, China's economic competition with the United States make United States begin to begin to concern China's growth in the Middle East. United States take actions to contain China's economic activities in the Middle East, especially in the high-tech areas like 5G, like dual technology areas. So we do not want to this kind of thing happen, but things happened.
Yeah. So basically, to sum up, I mean, the margin of compatibility between US and China interests in the region are basically neglected. There is a trend towards competition, a competition that probably is not in the interest of China, but is certainly being implemented by US, I say, global emerging, containment towards Chinese influence at a global level. And so certainly there is no space of cooperation, as you mentioned before. We fight our fight, you fight your fights, which is actually basically it's not a very good prospect for the Middle East in the sense that basically doesn't, especially if you consider the situation in JCPOA, and the Iranian problem that we discussed before. Certainly, this is not a good prospect. But maybe it's also true the fact that instability in the Middle East affects more directly the European countries, and probably less directly, but still more than in the US, China. So probably, as seen in the case of Iran, this situation will not impede Europe and China to somehow work and cooperate, in the region. What do you think?
Yes, I agree with your analysis. Actually, for China, the ideal policy is that China and the United States cooperate for common interest, for compatibilities. But the problem is that it is almost unlikely to cooperate in the foreseeable future. So we can, I think, China, Middle East countries, actually in the past 2 decades, I think especially in the Iranian nuclear issues, China-European Russia's cooperation is much more than China-United States cooperation. But now the new challenge is that in the past 2 years, United States and Europe has cooperated in its China policies. They are getting closer and closer. And in the past 2 years, on the one hand, China-United States relationship is getting worse. But on the other hand, China's European countries' relationship is also not bad. So under this situation, the challenge between China and Europe cooperation in the Middle East is also increasing. So in one word, the global strategic competition structure make the cooperation in the Middle East more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially if you consider the impact of the Ukrainian war, that certainly had an influence on on top of the recent tension between China and the US, that of course had a rebound effect on European approach to China. But certainly China's position, as we say before, the pro-Russian neutrality in the case of Ukraine didn't help at all in fixing and mending, these Sino-European relations. But if you have to mention a country that has proven, generally speaking, in your experience, more tuned with China's approach to the Middle East among the European countries, which country would you pick in terms of approach to the region or overlapping interest?
Which country?
Yeah, among the European countries.
I don't know.
Okay.
Actually,
no, because for example, there is your colleague and my acquaintance, Professor Jiang Jian, recently published an article on the impact of Ukraine war on Sino-European relations, and he emphasized how France and especially Macron reference to European strategic autonomy has been partially jeopardized by the event in Ukraine. But France certainly has always been an actor that historically, since the 1964, the recognition of China has been always more, proud of his independent stance in international affairs, and this was certainly something that was welcome by China. So my question was somehow I want to know whether, for example, France is a country that in the Iranian issue, but in the Middle East region, is considered by China a reliable interlocutor.
I think theoretically there is room to cooperate between China and European countries, but practically it's very difficult. The reason is that although the European country has always have different approach and a more pragmatic approach to the Middle East issues, but the problem is that in the past 10 years, the European countries' influence, involvement in the Middle East actually has declined. So they, you mentioned France. Actually, in the past 10 years, France has tried a few of times, want to some extent, France wanted to replace the United States' role in mediating between Israel and the Palestinians. Actually, France has sponsored a few of a global conference on the Palestinian issue. But in my opinion, their initiation has failed. So my opinion is that European countries' influence has declined in the past 10 years. So they, for most of the time, they are just following United States' policy. In the past, we used to say United States make policy, and the European country pay for the policy. But at the present time, I think United States make policy, Europe just follow United States policy.
Because we run out of money.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Niu, I have just because I know, you don't want to abuse of your time, but we have a few minutes left. I have just the last two questions. One is about process, and the other one is about sources. These are more academic questions. The first one is related to the way how China, actually bureaucratically, institutionally, produce policy, and in particular Middle East policy. In your article in Chinese that you kindly share with me, you mentioned at the end some recommendations, something that could be improved to make China policy more efficient and productive in the Middle East. And one point, the second one actually, was very interesting because you talk about improvement of decision making and the top-down design of policy. Traditionally, China's foreign economic and diplomatic activities are mainly in charge of some institution, NDRC, National Development Reform Commission, Energy Bureau, Minister of Commerce, SASAC, State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of National Defense, Public Security, and so forth and so on. I remember there was an article in 2006, a very important report published by CIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace, that at the time I was in China, and it was talking about this polarization of actors, including Chinese state-owned enterprises, that they played a major role, especially in cases like Middle East, for example, where energy companies, had a major role, in the way how then China's presence in the region was being, implemented. But then most recently, there was a reform, and some commissions such as Central Foreign Affairs Commission or a National Security Commission has been added to this structure in order to somehow centralize and harmonize, these different bureaucracies. Now, my question is this working? So how, if you have to describe in a nutshell, also for our students, a sort of a hierarchy of the decision-making process that somehow then becomes official policy of China. Can you give us some tips about it?
I think, as you mentioned, I recommended that in the future, China's different ministries, different institutions should improve its cooperation in the decision-making of Middle East policy. Actually, as you mentioned, China has already doing some works in this area. In the past decades, China has established the Central Foreign Affairs Committee and the Central National Security Committee. So this kind of institution is try to centralize policy making, especially try to coordinate different ministries. So why this is especially important for the Middle East policy? The reason is that the regional change in the Middle East, the situation in the Middle East required China to do this. As I mentioned before that, from the 1990s, since the end of Cold War to 2010, during this 30 years period, China's main interest in the Middle East is economic. So during that time, because activities, policy in the Middle East is not so complicated, not so complex. So there is no need to pay a lot of attention to different ministries' cooperation. But in the past few years, the situation in the Middle East has changed. As we just discussed that now, the great power competition, the diplomatic struggle, and the economic competition, and anti-terrorism, energy security. All these kind of factors mixed together makes China's Middle East policy more and more complicated. So this requires coordination between different institutions.
So, so just like the central decision-making body for, I mean, the most important organ of China Middle East policy, if you have to somehow describe them to our students, which are the organs? Because, you know, in the West, something that I always notice when I'm teaching about China to Westerners and students here in Italy is that the concept of the party-state mechanism is not very easy to understand when it comes to decision making. In Italy, you know, we have the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we know that, you know, somehow diplomacy, you know, has a specific, you know, location. So when it comes to China, it's a little bit more complicated. So can you give us some highlights on this?
Actually, I don't have the accurate answers. But my observation is that in terms of Middle East policy, at the present time, it is still the situation that different ministries is responsible for different areas, like economic bilateral trade between China and Israel, but not China and the Middle East is responsible for the international commercial ministry, and mutual foreign directive investment is responsible by the development and reform committee, and the foreign affairs, diplomatic relations, of course, is responsible of foreign affairs. So I still think that different ministries is directly responsible for the Middle East policies.
Okay, so in which way, so which kind of shortcoming or say weakness you were looking at in your article when you say that there is some improvement should be done? You mean in where do you see a sort of critical, I mean, an area of improvement in the decision making? You are still seeing a lot of, because, you know, this is basically also what Andrea Ghiselli was referring in his book. So do you still see a sort of polarization of different center of decision making, or, you know, the system has been centralized and you know what I mean? So which kind of critical aspects you think should be addressed in order to make this decision making more efficient?
I think for China's Middle East policy, personally, I think the first thing we need to do is that the whole country, different ministries, have to reach some kind of agreement. So what is the China Middle East strategy's first priority? So what is the sequence of different goals, and how much resources China want to invest in the Middle East? So this kind of thing need a centralized decision. So you cannot depend on different ministries to make a decision on this kind of grand ideas. So my personal opinion is that we first need a grand strategy, and different institutes should reach agreement on a grand strategy. Just like the national security strategy in United States. And if you have the grand strategy, different ministries will follow your central ideas.
So there is like still like a strong debate within China about the grand strategy. So this is what you are saying. I mean, there are different positions of which kind of grand strategies China is supposed to follow, and therefore this impact on China's Middle East policy. Correct?
Yeah, there is a long time debate about China's Middle East policy. So today, I think we have a lot of basic principles in terms of Middle East policy, but we don't have, at least we don't have a written comprehensive strategy.
Great. Tantian, sorry, I jumped to you in conclusion, just to let Professor Niu breathe a bit. What if you have to mention, and of course this is a question for Professor Niu, to our students, some key sources that can help us better understand China's policy in the region? You know that we, myself and Andrea, we are avid readers, and so the more we read, the more we understand, of course. So if you have to mention, some readings or author in China, or even abroad, if any. So your favorite ones, which one would you recommend? Besides Professor Niu Xinchun, we know that you're a big fan of Professor Niu. You have to unmute yourself.
I'm trying, but it seems I can't.
No.
No, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
About all these sources, actually, I prefer some. If in English, one of my favorites is All Monitor, US website, which I think its insights and its news is quite good. It's All Monitor.
All Monitor,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, All Monitor. I think it's quite famous and very insightful in the circle of Middle East scholars. Because I do some research like on Iraq and Libya, and there are some like more professional websites like World Oil, which is focused on energy related issues. And I think another, perhaps other sources is not that professional, but sometimes very interesting, like Middle East Eye, which is it's an English website, which is very pro-Palestinian and say some very harsh things about Israel. But some stories they produce are very interesting. About China's Middle East policies, I think there is a Twitter account called the Voice of China. I think it's China's Global South Voice, something like that. I cannot remember it very much, but I think Andrea retweeted this account quite often, which is a very good source for China's.
China, you mean China the Global South, right?
Yeah. China's
Enrico Lander.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they
helpful source.
Yeah, they translate our work in Arabic, so we actually have more reader in Arabic than we do in English.
Yeah, and also the CSIS, they have a certain program, I think called they have a certain program which translates lots of Chinese scholars' articles into English.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's also very helpful to understand China's Middle East sources. And there is, I think there is blog called China MED, which is published by a guy named Steve, but sorry, I forgot his family name. It produced some very updated news about China's involvement in this region, especially a lot of economic activities, which are quite.
Sorry, can you repeat, because this is, I'm not aware of it. China in
the Middle East. I think this is the name
China
of
in the Middle
this.
East. Okay.
Yeah,
China
it's long. Yeah. And also a guy called James Dorsey, which is he came to visit CICIR and Professor Niu once. I think he based in Singapore. His name is James Dorsey, and also has some very interesting opinions. And I read his articles quite often. And also sometimes, of course, I read a lot of articles in the think tanks, the so-called think tanks in Europe and United States. But Professor Niu has an opinion. I agree. Is that the quality of the analysis is somehow declining, because it's so easy for you to get some misleading information in the internet. Like China is already the biggest investor in the Middle East, and Iraq, which is a country I studied, is the receive most FDI from China in One Belt One Road initiative, BRA, which is totally incorrect. But if you just if you have not enough knowledge about this area, you just read some articles or media articles, you may think it's right. So sometimes the quality of news articles, even from some so-called professional or a very like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I think in this year I can remember like 4 or 5 articles about Wall Street Journal about China's Middle East policy are totally wrong. For example, like President Xi Jinping will visit Saudi Arabia last May. Yeah, Saudi Arabia will be President Xi's first country to visit after the COVID-19. It's exclusive news from Wall Street Journal, but it's wrong. So I think you have to judge. You have already have your basic information. You have your best judge before you realize. Yeah, sorry, please.
No. Sorry, Tiambo. No, I totally agree with you in the sense that, for example, with Andrea, when we were working on the data of the ChinaMed, Andrea can confirm that, we noticed that, a lot of database, some prominent database that are being used. Professor Niu actually mentioned some of them, actually one of them in his article, they actually put together numbers that are not supposed to be together. And then, of course, journalists, they refer to these numbers, because, they, of course, give credibility to these numbers, so the problem of data, when we start working on data on, it's enormous. There are, data are not, actually it's a big issue. I mean, if you go on the ChinaMed website, and you will see that there is a big caveat question that me and Andrea drafted in order to, to make sure that, what we are presenting, of course, has a lot of, fragility. But at least is honest, This is for sure. No, it's interesting to say. So my question to both of you, and then we close. You mentioned all sources that are basically Western ones, but how about regional scholars? Scholars from the region. I mean, is there someone you would like to suggest? I mean, I'm not asking you about Chinese experts, because I know you belong to the community, and wouldn't be polite for you to pick one instead of another one. But I can mention, for example, Professor Li Xiaoxian, which is like, in my opinion, is actually I learned a great deal from his writings. But when it comes to regional expert, which one? How is the milieu, the environment? You see that there is more, growing community of scholars looking at China, more expertise. Can you share some views?
After Professor Niu.
Professor Niu.
Yeah.
I think the most excellent expert from the region and from Europe, all is in this forum. Like I'm serious. Like in Saudi Arabia, Sudri.
Yeah.
Yeah,
excellent.
Sudri. I think he is very.
Our friend Mohammed, yes.
Yeah, and in other country, I think in Israel and UAE have a few of scholars is very good at China's policies. So other countries I didn't notice anyone.
Great. I guess, Tianbo, you agree with what Professor Niu said, right?
Yeah. Sudri, yes, is very good, but I think the experts' expertise differ. For example, like Sudri, he's very good at Gulf relationship with China, because I think Middle East and China is too big, and perhaps there are very few experts will choose like Middle East, like a whole region, its relationship with China as his priority. And in my opinion, I think more and more scholars tend to focus on the Gulf region. It's sometimes when I read a lot of paper talking about Middle East relationship with China, like what, I think you can just change the Middle East with Gulf, which perhaps is not true because you still have Iran, you have Turkey, you have Israel, and I agree with Professor Niu. We always know a lot from perhaps we disagree with each other, but I personally know a lot from Israeli experts in China's Middle East role. Yeah.
Yes. I agree. Israeli are really, I mean, my colleagues in Israel are top notch, and we have a very good cooperation with them as much as with everyone. So we enjoy being Italian. The possibility to have good relationship with everyone, very much similar to China in this sense, with a different perspective, by the way. We are actually working on the Gulf, and so we are publishing for Middle East policy a special issue that we are putting together. Mohammed Al-Sudair is part of it. Andrea Ghiselli, of course, is my co-editor on the role of the Gulf in Sino-US relations. And so we will let you know about this. And as a matter of fact, and then we close, Mohammed Al-Sudairi will be one of the speakers of this series, so you're welcome to join. And please, if any of your colleagues would like to join, this is a free platform for discussion, okay? So thank you so much, Professor Niu, for your time. Thank you, Tan Tianbo, for being here as well. And I look forward to seeing you upon my return in China. And until then, I wish you all the best.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.